The September 13th, 2011 Placer County Board of Supervisors meeting, and we'll have a flag salute led by Tony LaBeouf.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Tony. Ann, would you read our meeting procedures, please?
Welcome to the Placer County Board of Supervisors meeting of Tuesday, September 13th, 2011. Agendas are available on the wall outside this meeting room. If you are here to speak on an issue not appearing on the agenda, you may do so during the public comment period. There is a 3-minute time limit per speaker. The board is not permitted to take action on items addressed under public comment. When you speak, clearly state your name and address for the record. All items on the agenda will be open for the public to address before final action is taken. There is a 3-minute time limit per speaker, which will be monitored by a timer on the podium. If there is a person speaking on behalf of a group with no other testimony from another member of the group, please identify yourself as such, and your time may be extended at the pleasure of the board. Keep in mind that the chairman has the discretion of limiting the total discussion time on any item. If you are hearing impaired, we have listening devices available. It is requested that all pagers and cell phones be either turned off or put in the silent mode. Thank you for your participation and cooperation.
Thanks, Ann. Now is the time for public comment. This is the time when anybody can address the board on something that is not on the agenda, keeping in mind that we can take no action today. Please come forward and state your name.
And I am on the 211 Placer Steering Committee. And I urge the supervisors to support the implementation of 211 Community Service Telephone Number for our county. 211 is a telephone number that quickly connects people with vital community services. It's easy to remember, it's free to use, it's always available. It's local information, and it's answered by a real person. It's confidential, available 24 hours a day, multilingual, and it will also be online. I want to echo what Dr. Rich Burton said after members of our committee explained the benefits of 211. Dr. Burton responded, 211 would be an added value for Placer County and its residents. Indeed it would. The Placer County Board of Supervisors will have the final okay before the switch is thrown and 211 becomes a reality for Placer County. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bev Anderson, 28320 Secret Town Court, Colfax, California, and I'm chair of the 211 Placer Steering Committee. I wanted to let you know that we are really moving along. Things are progressing. I've talked to most of you already, so you know what the picture is. And we're actually, on Thursday of this week, we're having our steering committee meeting, and it'll be at Fellowship Hall at Pioneer United Methodist Church here in Auburn, and from 8 till noon. From 10 till noon. That's a little... 10 till noon, and we'll be having Holly Sassoni from Nevada County, who is is one of their lead people, and she will be giving us more information and giving a presentation and answering questions. And we'll have some other lead people. Dr. Rich Burton is going to be there, so any of you are quite welcome to come if you'd like to be there. We are going to be able to prove our lead agency that has volunteered to say, hey, we'll be your lead agency if you like. So now we're looking for a fiscal agent that will be the accounting for our grants that we hope to receive. And now we're going to be in the funding raising portion. Any of you that have any idea of anyone that would like to be in on the ground floor with this and have their name on the roll of record and the roll of honor, 1,000 or 2 or more, or whatever they'd like to put in. We do have some funders that are already approaching us, so we're excited. we think this is a go. We waited to be able to talk to people about funding until we knew that we had the show on the road and there was a good chance to launch, so that they wouldn't be putting their money behind something they were guessing was going to happen. So we're just really hopeful that things are going to roll from now. And anything you've got that you'd like to say to us or along the way, or give us some suggestions, and we would appreciate it. And as Craig said, actually in the long run we'll need to have an agreement and a letter from you that it's okay for us to go ahead. PUC requires that. They're just picky. So we appreciate that you get to have a chance to be a major part of it.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public wish to address the board on something not on the agenda? See no one, I'll close public comment and bring it back to board committee reports. Jennifer.
Thank you. I have a number of brief items that I just want to touch on, all related somehow to forestry. Supervisor Holmes and I attended a tour of the Sierra Nevada Adaptive Management Plan work project up at Last Chance above Forest Hill yesterday. It was a very interesting tour that allowed us to compare some different forestry techniques that are designed for multi-purposes. The first, of course, being getting some logging and some biomass out of our forests, but also some different approaches to fire protection as a result of that project. We did witness some extremely large slash piles that are going to be burned off that, God willing, someday we will get to a biomass facility for processing instead of just open burning them. But it was a really excellent tour. It was led by UC Davis. We had some researchers from UC Berkeley there. We had the Forest Service. We had CAL FIRE, Sierra Pacific Industries, representative from Norman Gonzalez from Representative McClintock's office. A lot of people from the conservation community. Excellent tour, great information, and frankly an opportunity for some very disparate groups of people to get together to understand the ground that we do share in terms of looking at protecting our forests. On a slightly related topic, I did want to thank the chair personally for your letter that you sent last week regarding the state responsibility area fees that were proposed. The good news is that the state legislature did end their 2011 session early Saturday morning without taking any action on the legislation to increase those fees. So at this point, my understanding is the fee schedule that was adopted by the Board of Forestry to the first proposal does actually remain in effect. So that was the original $150 fee with a number of offsets that would offset rates for many people as low as to $35 per year. The other half of that, however, is that it's quite clear that some folks in the state legislature are planning on bringing this back in a new and more costly form. So while we have not won the long-term war, we did win this one battle, but we're going to need to keep our eyes on it. It's a little hard to realize down here right now, but we have some pretty dramatic thunder and lightning, or lightning and thunder storms going on up in the Sierras. We do have a lot of fires that have started, not too many in Placer County, but given some of our concerns about funding for CAL FIRE, the state response fee, just wanted to point out that we should be keeping our fingers crossed that we continue to avoid any major fires. There have been a number of starts. They've all been attacked fairly quickly, and they seem to be being contained. But just as a heads up, these battles are going to continue to face us, and I look for all of your support in continuing to oppose some of these state fees. So thank you.
Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These aren't necessarily committee reports, but I did want to report that on Saturday I attended the junior livestock auction at the Gold Country Fair. Well represented. It was outstanding with this downturn in our economy. the amount of people that showed up to buy those animals that those young people nurtured and brought forward. Salvation Army has raised $24,000 for their Feed the Hungry program. There were several steers and hogs that were donated to the Salvation Army that will be processed, and then there'll be enough food, hopefully, for our disadvantaged community to have some protein in their diet. But I was really impressed with the amount of turnout for the junior livestock auction. On another note, on Friday night, I attended the 9/11 remembrance for the 10th anniversary of 9/11. At Auburn, the cruise night, they had a ceremony. And then on Sunday, there was 2 ceremonies in Rockland at R.C. Willey. As many of you know, R.C. Willey closes on Sundays. City of Rockland headlined the first event from noon till about 2 or 2:30, and then William Jessup University had a ceremony from 3 to 4. It was well attended, and so I just want to let you know that I was out. The county was well represented in 9/11 remembrances. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. Anyone else? See none? Next on the agenda is the consent agenda. This is a list of items intended to be passed or considered all in one motion. But if any of my colleagues would like to pull something in, or anybody from the public would like us to discuss those independently, we would be happy to do that.
7A, Mr. Chairman.
Pardon?
7A.
7A?
Move approval of the remaining consent agenda.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda with the removal for specific discussion of item 7A, and roll call.
Montgomery?
Yes.
Duran?
Yes.
Holmes?
Yes.
Euler? Weigand?
Yes. Thanks. So we will now take up 7A, Health and Human Services, adopt the ordinance 6.0408, et cetera, with regards to animal situations, obsolete language, cleanup work that we discussed at our last meeting. Rosemary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Rosemary Freeborn. I'd like to discuss 2 items that are on the proposed ordinance. And the first one is one of the definitions of potentially dangerous, and that would be any dog which, when unprovoked on 2 separate occasions, engages in any behavior that requires a defensive action by any person to prevent bodily injury when the person and the dog are off the property of the owner of the dog. I believe that allowing an animal to assault our citizens needs to really be looked at closely, and I think that we shouldn't allow 2 offenses. It should be 1 offense and animal control called out and an investigation ensued to determine if, in fact, there's merit to the complaint. What happens in this case would be, if the dog is identified as potentially dangerous, it would be required to be put behind a enclosure, wear a muzzle when it's off its property. I believe it has to have a specially colored vest, be identified with a microchip, and be on a leash. We have our leash law now. I think we have a lot of historical information that tells us that we have a problem with these animals, and that this ordinance should be amended at this point and not looked at, again at 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. And if there could be an amendment to that language, I think for public safety that would certainly be great. The other item on page 196 of your handbook is item G, that says transfer of ownership of a dog deemed potentially dangerous or vicious may only be done with written permission granted by the Director of Animal Services, his or her designee. An animal that is identified as potentially dangerous or vicious has gone through the hearing, has been shown to have a propensity to attack or harass people. And to transfer that dog to another owner without any understanding of what the capabilities of that owner, what criteria or what provisions, what due diligence is completed to enable the director to determine that that new home, that new owner is in fact going to be adequate to keep that dog corralled or maintained. And so I can also tell you that while it's, I'll be real quick, while it's indicated that it will happen on an occasion, I can tell you that it tends to be sort of standard to transfer these animals out of our area or transfer them to other rescue groups or individuals. And I believe, again, in the best interest of public safety, I think that should be eliminated and no dogs should be allowed to be transferred. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary. Anyone else from the public wish to address this item? Pleasure of my colleagues. Kirk?
Yeah, if we could have Dr. Starr maybe address the concerns that were raised, I'd appreciate that. In particular, the concern regarding the language specifying on 2 separate occasions. After meeting with Rosemary yesterday, I kind of share the concern in regard to why we would require there be 2 separate reported instances. As you're well aware, I'm sure there are a number of confrontations that occur between animals, particularly dogs and people, that we don't find out about. And this would obviously specify 2 separate reported occasions, otherwise we wouldn't know about it. I'm kind of her thinking that, to me, one is enough to kind of put people on notice that we have a potentially dangerous dog. If a dog is confronting people off of their property unprovoked, that's a potentially dangerous animal as far as I'm concerned. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on striking the language on 2 separate occasions, what that would mean to you in terms of workflow management within your department, those kinds of things.
Thank you for the question. I'll start with the end, I think, maybe go back to the beginning. As far as workflow management and impact on us, we would have more reports to track and things like that. I can't give you a number of staff hours or things like that. I don't think that would be a huge issue here. I think that the key thing with this package, especially the potentially dangerous and vicious animal section, which is really, I think, where we put most of our effort in the revision of this ordinance, is we started with the old county ordinance, which was woefully inadequate, I guess we could say. Certainly outdated, maybe is probably a more correct way to describe it. And we looked at the state law, we looked at other jurisdictions, and these particular definitions that we're talking about are patterned after state law. And that particular one we actually strengthened over the existing state law. So the existing state law says 2 such incidents within 36 months, and we dropped the within 36 months, so it's now a lifetime 2 strikes, if you will, type of approach. And if you look at the definitions, there's an incremental scale, I guess you could say, or incremental impact of increasing offenses. So this one is making someone take defensive action, but no actual injury or bite occurred. The next one is there is a bite to a person, not a super severe bite, but a significant bite. The next one is a bite attack to an animal. We heard about from Mr. and Mrs. Rickey about their experience. And those are on the potentially dangerous category. Then the vicious category is a severe bite to a human, and there's some other criteria. So all of those are kind of incremental, and so those other ones I describe are single incidents. This one is the least damaging type of incident, and so it's appropriate in both state law and ours to be 2 incidents. And the other thing I guess we have to look at is there's a balance between the rights of the citizens and their ownership of dogs and things like that, and potential concerns that we hear often neighbors complaining about neighbors just because they don't like them or don't like their dog. Our officers are pretty good at sorting that out, and there's a process to do that. But there's several people have expressed concerns that one incident probably would be a little too liberal on this one, that someone could just say, hey, I think their dog was scared me and I had to take evasive action. So that's where we landed here. Certainly a gray area, and there's potentially other approaches we could take with a single incident that don't rise to the level of a potentially dangerous animal designation and those restrictions. The last thing, just the addition to our leash law, that change in the ordinance, which we haven't talked as much about, but that gives us more tools to deal with these situations than we had in the past as well. So that a dog that's doing this behavior that's been described, making someone take evasive action, is of course going to be off leash at the time. And we have restrictions now that allow us to address that dog using the restrictions on a dog that is at large inappropriately, in citations and things like that.
Okay. And then to the other issue that was raised in terms of the transfer of the ownership, what is currently the process, and then what is being considered to be the process in terms of transfer of ownership and kind of a determination that the person to whom the dog is being transferred, A, is well aware of the dog's history in terms of aggressive behavior, and then B, it's being transferred into a suitable environment where we are not creating a hazard for others around. What kinds of protections do we have now, or what's being envisioned under this?
What we have now is entirely policy-based. I don't think our current ordinance really speaks to this. What this provision does is it gives us the option in a rare situation to be able to transfer ownership if it's appropriate. And so the example that's commonly used is that everyone's heard about is the dogs that Michael Vick owned. And those, under the law, because they're fighting dogs, are automatically designated as vicious. But some of them were rehabilitated successfully and placed in good homes, and there was no hazard with that. It's I don't know, how many experiences we've had with this in the last 10 years, but very few. And but that's what it's there for. That provision is not an entitlement. It doesn't suggest that someone has this privilege and can transfer an animal, or every case would be closely and has been in the past scrutinized. And I'll just say too that the law provides the tools for us to implement policy and use our the judgment of our professional staff to address situations like this. If we ever were to transfer an animal that's in one of these categories, it would be very closely scrutinized, as well as where it's going and the home it's going into, all the things that were raised. We would scrutinize. Not everything that's done is written in the ordinance, because that gives our program the ability to implement it.
Right. Okay. And then quickly jumping back to the first item that we discussed in regard to on two separate occasions. Clearly, the greatest incentive to correct a dog's behavior is if the owner feels the pinch, if you will, of aggressive behavior. You described a scenario where, by virtue of the adoption of this language or strengthening the leash laws, what is the consequence to an owner if somebody files that first report right now?
So the consequence would be if someone felt they took evasive action?
Yes.
In order to prevent bodily injury?
I'm getting into my car and my neighbor's dog approaches and confronts me.
So, if an officer would go out and if they, based on the accounts of the witness or the individual, felt that it fit the description, that they had to take defensive action, I think it's described as what a reasonable person would do, and that they weren't just simply scared of a friendly dog or something like that. Then the person would that would be basically one strike against that dog, and so we would keep a record of that. And then the person who owned the dog would receive a citation for the dog being off leash and at large, and whatever the officer felt was appropriate restrictions. The citation would be a fiscal penalty. I don't know what the charge would be.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
The citation, I don't know what the fiscal penalty of that citation is off the top of my head.
Okay.
For being off leash.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Jack.
Yeah.
I do share some of the concerns. I think what we're trying to do here is balance, there's a balancing act here with the rights of dog owners as well as the rights of the public to be safe. And I get the impression that this new ordinance is much better. You've been working on it for, 15 months or so to try to get it dialed in correctly. And if what I'm hearing is that the new ordinance is somewhat better and somewhat more comprehensive than the prior ordinance, and that it appears to me that there are other tools to address a single incidence of an outward expression by an animal. I would suggest, because there is this concern, that we take a look at this 12 months from now based on the data, and if there are additional incidents that come up between now and then, that we remain flexible in our ability to act on this, to change it. So, and I know you're going to be going through some additional changes again as we move forward, correct?
Yeah, and I appreciate those comments. We have, as I described last time, the process of doing this involved the Animal Services Advisory Committee quite intensively, and that committee's identified a couple loose ends that they think might be appropriate to change, so we'll revisit those. It's not like this, we're done and we won't come back to it for 10 years by any means. So all this stuff is a work in progress, and we've already implemented, after our meeting with you, some processes to track the data that you're talking about.
Good, and I'm glad you raised that, because that's really what I don't want people to think, is that we're just going to go ahead and bless this and go move about our business, that we're actually, this is a living document, and if we need to come back, we're going to be taking a close eye on the data, and if we need to make changes, we can act on those at that time. So.
Thank you.
Jennifer.
Thank you. I want to just echo Supervisor Duran's comments. When we adopted the hen ordinance, as you recall, we said, hey, come back to us in a year, show us the metrics. If there is this, predicted hen apocalypse, we'll readdress the ordinance at that point. And I think we can do the same thing with this. All of our documents at the county are living, breathing documents that do evolve over time. And I think we should take a look at what actually happens on the grounds after we adopt this, and if there are problems at that time, address them. But in the meantime, I'm very comfortable adopting the language that's in front of us today, and I thank you and the committee for all your hard work.
Anyone else from the public wish to address this item? Seeing none, I think one consensus item I heard, Mark, is that if you could bring it back to us in 12 months with some data collection and report how things are working and or where we may need to do some modifications. But with that, what's the pleasure of the board?
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve the ordinance as discussed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Our first timed item is not until 10 o'clock, so we will take up our first department item, which is County Exec's Roseville annexation. And it looks to me like there's no one in the city of Roseville at work right now, so we'll be willing to discuss this early and receive any input from anyone who might like to address the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board.
Morning.
I'm Holly Heinzen with the County Executive Office. Never fear, I'm not going to do a PowerPoint, but I did want to be able to pop up the map so everybody could be looking at the same thing at the same time in color. The item before you today, it has been a long time coming, and the action we're requesting of you today is to consider a resolution that authorizes the chairman of the Board of Supervisors to execute sales and property tax sharing agreements with the city of Roseville to provide revenue, basically, for projects currently known as the Sierra Vista Specific Plan, the Creekview Specific Plan, and Reason Farms. The resolution would also authorize the county executive officer to enter into an MOU with the city of Roseville to adjust the city's sphere of influence for Sierra Vista and pull back the sphere of influence of the city of Roseville from the Sunset Industrial Community Plan area. These annexations represent, as I think you're all aware at this point, significant growth for the city of Roseville and Placer County, with approximately 30,000 new residents projected and about 5,000 jobs. It increases the city's development capacity by about 25%. Understand that these annexations would, while they may occur more immediately, the development that would occur would be over an extended time horizon. So we're looking at 30, 40 years in some cases that the development would actually occur. So as we look at these annexations and how we fund services over time, we necessarily have to make a range of assumptions to ensure, from the county's perspective, that countywide services continue to be provided at the current level. And the city, of course, assumes responsibility for municipal type services. And those would include police patrol, fire, and land use control. We believe that these agreements meet the needs of the city and the county over time to meet the obligations of serving these new residents. As you can see by the map up on the wall, this is really just a location map to show you where these areas are located within the county. Primarily, the areas that are proposed to be covered by these agreements are located west of the city of Roseville. As you see, north of the city of Roseville is the Sunset Industrial Area, and then further north is the city of Lincoln. These agreements are somewhat different than the approach that has been previously taken by the county, and I think it's a good approach. These agreements cover 3 different annexations. As most of you are aware, as we've proceeded with prior annexations, they've been pretty much on an annexation by annexation basis. The issue with that is it's much harder to spread your costs over a broader area, and more importantly, it is harder to adjust for variations in tax rate areas. And as all of you have heard before, the county has a broad array of tax rate areas. Unfortunately, in this area, particularly in the Sierra Vista specific plan, although that whole West Placer area, there's a relatively low tax rate that we have to share with cities as they assume responsibilities in those areas. So to say that this was a challenge to meet these obligations with the revenues that would come out of these agreements is an understatement. And I think with a variety of efforts and methodologies and approaches and gives and takes on both sides, we've brought to you some agreements that work well. In this west area, we have tax rate areas that are less than 13% of the total. In some of our other annexations, we were negotiating over 45% of the 1%. So that's a huge difference. On average, the tax rate areas, or the amount available to negotiate, was about 30% less. So as you can tell just by those kind of numbers, these were challenges, and I really give credit to the team that worked on these. By providing a broader area and combining these, we could accommodate some of the fluctuations in the tax rate areas to balance it out. Of course, the sales tax agreement provides for another source of revenue that helps the county maintain services over time. So with that, I just want to talk a very little bit about the individual annexations, and if you have detailed questions about the specific plans or the projects, I know there's representatives from the City of Roseville to discuss those with you. I'm really going to focus on the financial arrangements that support the annexations that would occur in these areas. The Sierra Vista specific plan is in the blue there. It would hold about 4,500 in population. In addition, there's been a recent amendment that's noted as the Westbrook Amendment. That includes about 2,029 residential units with 43.3 acres of commercial development. The Sierra Vista specific plan would also include a sphere of influence amendment of about 373 acres, and I will discuss that a little more in terms of the MOU that is identified for that project. The Creekview specific plan to the north, you'll see in yellow. The Creekview specific plan is a 501-acre project area and is located immediately north and west of the West Roseville specific plan. It's about 4 miles from Blue Oaks Boulevard interchange on State Route 65. The Creekview specific plan is within the city's existing sphere of influence and includes a total of 2,011 single-family and multifamily units. It includes 190,000 square feet of commercial and business professional development, as well as 161 acres for parks, open space, and other public uses. The Reason Farms project, I know you have all heard about that over time. It's in the red there. The Reason Farms project is basically 12 parcels proposed for annexation, primarily that are owned by the city and were purchased to construct a retention basin to mitigate for the city's impact on flooding in Sutter County, potential flooding in Sutter County. In order for these annexations to proceed, a resolution executing the agreements is required by LAFCO. The agreements provide for revenue sharing in terms of property taxes as well as sales taxes. In addition, working in tandem with these agreements is a memorandum of understanding that addresses the city and county's agreements with respect to adjusting the spheres of influence. The terms of the revenue sharing agreements together are as follows, and there's just a few key points here. One, with the property and sales tax sharing agreements, the county would receive the equivalent of 18.25% of the 1% property tax across all of the annexation areas. Two, the county would receive 11.5 cents on the dollar of the 1% Bradley Burns sales tax attributable to the annexation areas. Beginning in the 15th year following annexation of the first property, the county would receive up to 16% of the 1% sales tax revenue. This increase would be based on a fiscal analysis to be conducted at that time that would evaluate the relative financial and fiscal health of the county relative to the city of Roseville following annexation. In no event would that sales tax distribution be reduced less than the 11.5 cents that is currently provided for in the agreement. So there's a potential for the upside, but not on the downside. Finally, these agreements provide for a transition period. This transition period would have the equivalent of 100% of the property tax be retained by the county for the first 5 years, and all of the sales tax be retained by the city over the first 5 years. I think this reflects the development that we see occurring, and that the county has existing obligations as well as for our existing services. In addition, the Dry Creek Fire District would continue operating in that area. So that 5-year is kind of this transition time as we move to this new model. I want to talk just for a second about the MOU that speaks to the sphere of influence adjustments. The annexation proposals, as I noted, include sphere amendments for annexations for Sierra Vista and for Reason Farms. In addition, the county has long planned in the Sunset Industrial area that it would serve as a job center, and indeed, to the extent it's developed now, has served as a job center that provides regional benefit and assists in funding vital county services. As you know, it's one of the primary areas for non-residential development in the unincorporated area. The county relies on current and future revenues attributable to the SIA as an integral element of short and long-range financial planning. The City of Lincoln has already pulled back their sphere boundaries from the Sunset Industrial Area, and with this MOU, the city would intend to do the same. As such, the proposed MOU provides for the adjustments to the sphere, which is about 372 acres for the Sierra Vista specific plan, about 1,659 acres for Reason Farms, and the Sunset Industrial Area is about 3,800 acres. And that would be the pullback of the sphere for the city of Roseville. I want to talk a little bit about the fiscal impact and the methodology of these fiscal studies so that we all have an understanding of how they work and what is funded and what is not funded, because I think that's important to know. The result of these negotiations was really not predicated on one fiscal study. It was really a series of fiscal studies and an iterative process with the city of Roseville as negotiations occurred. The analyses for both the city and the county were based on very similar, in fact, I would say substantially the same methodologies. The analyses compare the cost to serve new development with anticipated revenues using per capita costs and revenues, as well as project-specific estimates for property and sales tax. The analyses really look to see the extent to which project revenues cover the costs associated with generally the current level of service. Keeping in mind these are a couple years old, but generally the current level of service. As I noted earlier, these were combined across all of the annexation areas, so depending on the tax rate area, when you start segregating them, they don't work. All together, they work well. So as we move through this, primarily property and sales tax, in fact only property and sales tax are the revenues that are associated with these agreements. In sum total, all property tax is estimated at $11.4 million across all annexation areas. In addition, on-site commercial development at build-out would generate about $7.4 million in sales taxes annually within the plan area and another $1 million in sales taxes annually at build-out that would be generated elsewhere in the city. The values that were identified to support this $11.4 million in property tax at build-out is based on values of about $140,000 for multifamily and about $400,000 for low-density residential. Those are primarily the revenues that the county and the city negotiated to support county services and city services within the city. Across all the annexation areas, total baseline costs for the county, i.e. existing county services, are about $13.2 million. That doesn't include new costs that we see coming down the pike entirely, but it does include all of our existing service levels. In fact, service levels from about 2 years ago, I think would be reasonable to say. While it does not include capital obligations, it does include the capital facilities fees for new capital facilities that would be required as new development occurs. And that would be for county-wide type facilities that are required as new development occurs. Before property and sales taxes are shared, we netted out revenue that the county otherwise receives that could be attributable to this development to the tune of about $5.6 million. When we look at the additional revenues that would accrue through these agreements, we'd have about $7.7 million in property tax at build-out and $887,000 in sales tax. We believe these would offset the remaining costs of existing county operating costs. In addition, the property tax identified is roughly equivalent to the existing county average of property tax shares of the 1% countywide. We think it's important as annexations occur that the county's property tax base is not eroded and that it is used to support services in a roughly equivalent level across the county. So the net impact to the county, as I already stated, we believe these revenue sharing agreements provide for existing costs and existing levels of service. It would also provide, all things remaining equal, about half of future operating costs for the South Placer facility, their proportionate share. The net impact to the city of Roseville would be approximately $600,000 to $2.6 million in additional revenues, depending upon shifts in retail spending patterns anticipated by the city. With that, as I stated, our recommendation is that the board authorize the chairman to enter into the revenue sharing agreements with the city and authorize the county executive officer to execute the memorandum of understanding. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions, comments at this time by board members? I see none. Oh, Jack.
Actually, I'll go ahead and make a comment now and then reserve a minute or two afterwards. Thank you very much, Holly, for bringing this forward. I just wanted to say a couple of things. I really do appreciate the support that was provided by the county, by yourself, by our executive officer, Tom Miller, and also Tony LaBeouf, that also participated in the negotiation team for this particular agreement. And I will say that it was one of the most difficult agreements that I've ever faced, and for good reason. You know, it was right at the get-go, at the start of this, it became apparent to me at how important these revenue streams are to both the city and the county. And, you know, when you're doing a negotiation outside of the public kind of realm, there's always an emphasis on the win. For us, I think it was a matter of defining what a win is. And it was not necessarily winning, but it was just trying to find out, you know, a fair understanding of what the revenue streams were. And at the same time, you know, if we focus on a win, someone loses. And that, you know, means necessarily it's either the county or the city. But, you know, I think our focus was finding the revenue streams and finding that kind of that sweet spot. I think that we could have our county services taken care of and at the same time provide an opportunity for the city of Roseville and the stakeholders that are involved that have been waiting so long to put this thing together and to move on with their project, the ability to do that. And you know, I know at the beginning of the negotiation process, you know, there was a lot of things. I know that there's a very, very long history. Fortunately for me, I was a part of that, and it was just my, you know, focus of, you know, is this a good thing to get completed? Can we get it completed in the right time and under the right circumstances, and also to get it right? So I think that's, you know, that's kind of where we are in this particular process. It's been very educational for me, and I do again appreciate the county support in seeing this through.
Any other questions or comments? Holly, it might be in the staff report, so I apologize, but what was the average property tax available throughout the whole area for which we negotiated the memorandum?
The average property tax per capita?
Available for local government sharing. No, just the average percent of a dollar available. You talked about the high being about...
Countywide is about 18 point...
No.
Oh, you mean within the annexation area?
Correct.
Yeah, it ranged about 14%, and I'll tell you what the issue is that depending on where development occurs, we were using weighted averages.
Right.
So it was, you know, between 14 and 15%.
Was the average property tax available to share in the annexation area?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks. Jim, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to express my thanks, too, to Holly and the team that were in these somewhat difficult and sometimes trying negotiations. I know it's been ongoing for quite a while. I particularly want to thank you, Supervisor Duran, for your leadership in this and bringing this forward, and also the chairman for his leadership on this. So anyhow, I just wanted to express my thanks.
Jennifer?
I too really want to express my thanks. I know this has been a long time incoming. And I really want to thank Supervisor Duran for holding everybody's feet to the fire and really making sure that this continued to move forward and didn't remain in sort of the stasis that it has been in for a while for a number of reasons. Holly, I actually wanted to ask a couple of questions about this map. For people who may be listening at home, can you give just a very brief thumbnail description of the difference between a sphere of influence, as reflected by the dots on this map, and the city limits? And that's probably a really complicated question, but I think it's something that people are very confused by.
Okay, I'll be happy to take a crack at it, and I'm going to give a very simple answer. The city limits basically denote the area under which the city has an obligation to provide the municipal type services and an obligation to provide police, patrol, fire, etc. The sphere of influence is really a planning area, and the city does not have an obligation to provide services in those areas, but it does denote the area to which annexation could occur or future growth would occur. So it's clearly a planning area. And, you know, if you need additional detail on that, I'm sure someone from planning would be able to provide some additional detail.
Yeah, and I only ask it because a number of people have asked me about the Sierra Vista specific plan, the Creekview, you know, and those are not reflected there in, you know, the ad area, but they are the sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. And just the concern that members of the public have had is who has responsibility for that area, for those services. So I think your answer should clarify that. On the same map, I'm wondering what the dotted line just to the right of Brookfield and the left of the Sunset Industrial Area means that runs up past Sunset Boulevard.
The dotted line would reflect the community plan boundaries.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments by the board? Is there anyone from the public who'd like to address this item? Good morning, Ray.
Morning, Chairman Wygannon and the board. I'm Ray Courage, City Manager for the City of Roseville. And has been mentioned, the City and County has been negotiating this deal for some time. It's been a tough negotiation, but I believe we're all pleased, and certainly I'm relieved that we've gotten to a win-win here for both the county and the city. I would just like to thank the board for its support, but I would particularly like to thank Supervisor Duran for his leadership and skill in helping us navigate some of these tough areas that we've encountered. And I think his participation in this was absolutely crucial. I'd also like to thank Chief Executive Tom Miller and Holly and Tony and his staff for all their help in pulling this all together. I think at the end of the day, this is going to be great for the city and great for the county. And for me, this is hopefully a model of future cooperation that we can have together on projects as we move forward in annexation. So I'm here with Russ Branson if there's any technical questions or any questions you have for us on that perspective, but I'm just so pleased and relieved that this is nearly over. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Any, Jack?
Yeah, and Ray, while you're up there, I just wanted to thank you and your staff and Mayor Pauline Ricucci. You know, throughout this whole process, you kept an open mind. I know that one of the things that we identified at both groups, city and county, was the fact of risk. And if you look at these agreements, they contain some very interesting openers and some very interesting language that kind of provides a sense of security for both jurisdictions. And I agree with you. I hope that at the end of the day, this is the start of a very good new beginning. There's always going to be a little bit of friction between jurisdictions. That's the nature of things. But I'm hoping that we can look at the horizon in the same lens. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else from the public like to address this item? See no one, what's the pleasure of the board? It's been moved and seconded to approve authorizing the chair to sign essentially the tax sharing agreements, sales and property tax, and also the adjustment of the sphere of influence. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Holly. We'll now take up our second department item, Facility Services, Dry Creek Community Park Phase 1 Utilities, Project 4748. Joel.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Again, Joel Swift, Deputy Director of Facility Services Department. I have with me as well Robin Holtz, our Capital Improvements Manager. The request before your board today includes two related actions for the Dry Creek Community Park, which is project number 4784. The first being to approve the plans and specifications and authorize staff to solicit bids for Phase 1 utilities of the project. And the second, to approve a resolution authorizing the Director of Facility Services or designee to award and execute a contract in an amount not to exceed $576,000 upon review by County Council and Risk Management, and delegating authority to approve any necessary change orders. This Phase 1, which is the utilities, the infrastructure along Warlargo Road, includes roughly 1,264 linear feet of 10-inch sanitary sewer, 1,215 linear feet of domestic water, 746 linear feet of storm drain. The design documents for this phase are now complete and ready to be competitively bid. The engineer's estimate of probable construction costs is, including contingency for Phase 1, is $576,000. Phase 2, the next phase, will be intended to include the remaining on-site utility cost systems not covered in Phase 1, construction of the park entrance, portion of the parking, landscape improvements, accessibility improvements, restrooms, and a tot lot. Those Phase 2 improvements are currently scheduled to begin construction in the spring of 2012. Ultimate build-out of the future park amenities, including additional parking, ball fields, and tennis courts, would be constructed as additional funding became available. This total cost for Phase 1 is estimated at $1,157,765, which includes that $576,000 for construction and contingency, and roughly $581,000 for design, project management, bidding, permit fees, and contract administration. There is sufficient funding appropriated in the project account for Phase 1. And in order to proceed with the improvement project, it is recommended that your board approve the plans and specifications, authorize staff to solicit the bid, and delegate the appropriate authority to award and execute the resulting contract. We'd be happy to answer any questions your board may have regarding this request.
Thanks, Joel. Questions, comments by board members? Jack.
Just a comment. I want to thank Facility Services in planning for moving forward on this, staying on top of it. I know there have been some challenges that you've worked through. Really excited to see this finally going out to bid for Phase 1. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone from the public wish to address this item? See no one, bring it back to the board for action.
Second.
It's Jennifer 1. It's been moved and seconded to approve the park plans and specifications, Dry Creek Community Park as discussed, and the contract not to exceed $576,000. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
And why don't we wrap up? We have Sewer Maintenance District 3 Regional Sewer, Bill Zimmerman. That'll take care of our department items.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm Bill Zimmerman with Facility Services.
Morning.
This morning we're asking your board to adopt a resolution that will allow our director to execute an amendment to our agreement with Analytical Environmental Services for the environmental analysis of the SMD3 Regional Sewer Project. The amendment is for an amount not to exceed $144,402, and it will increase the total amount of the agreement from $116,455 to $260,857. Back in August of 2010, your board approved the original agreement with AES to perform the CEQA documentation for the project. AES is on our list of pre-qualified environmental firms, and we did go through a competitive proposal process to select them for this project. Because the project is partially funded with federal grant dollars, in addition to complying with CEQA, we also need to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And initially, the Army Corps of Engineers, which is the federal lead agency for the project, indicated that they wanted to self-perform that analysis, and so that's the reason we didn't include it in our original agreement with AES. Subsequent to that, the Corps of Engineers has informed us that they don't have staffing right now to complete that work in-house, and so the county is responsible for completing the NEPA analysis. So with that as background, we negotiated the amendment we have before you today with AES to complete the NEPA evaluation. The amendment also includes a number of optional tasks at the county's discretion that may be needed as we work through the environmental review and subsequent permitting process. And those optional tasks are for things like wetland delineations and surveys and studies and surveys for the red-legged frogs. So the total cost of the amendment is $144,402. There is adequate funding in the capital project budget for the SMD3 regional sewer project, and 75% of the cost, both of the work under the amendment and our staff time in administering it, is eligible for reimbursement under the grant funds. And with that, again, our recommendation is that your board adopt the resolution that's included with our staff report. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Bill. Questions? Jack?
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing this forward. What is the timetable to complete the NEPA document?
The environmental review process, both NEPA and CEQA, should be completed in June of next year, and then we'll follow that up with construction starting hopefully in the fall of 2012.
Thank you very much.
Anyone from the public wish to address this item? Seeing none, pleasure of the board. Moved and seconded to approve a contract amendment not to exceed $144,402 as related to the environmental review just discussed on SMD3. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. We'll now take up our 10 o'clock timed item, which is Community Development Resources Agency, our 2010 Census Redistricting map discussion. Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Michael Johnson with the Community Development Resource Agency. This is the first of two public hearings as required by state law for the board to consider the new boundaries for redistricting as a result of the 2010 census. Just as a bit of a background, the map on the wall here are the current district boundaries as approved by the Board of Supervisors back in 2001. As we have discussed in previous hearings, based upon the last census, there has been significant population growth, primarily in the western part of the county, and the board is now required to amend the boundaries of supervisorial districts to be responsive to those boundaries. The deadline for completing this process is November 1st, and as I stated, this is the first of two public hearings that will be held to allow the board to meet that identified deadline. Some of the factors that the board has considered as it's looked at the various maps is the cohesiveness and compactness and continuity of the various districts, while at the same time trying to minimize the deviation between the various supervisorial districts. The goal is to be 5% or less, although with special findings, you can allow for the deviation to be greater than 5%. Based upon the map that was considered by your board at the August 9th hearing, in an effort to achieve a parity of 69,684 persons per district, staff has prepared a map that has drawn boundaries that reflect this number of persons for each supervisorial district. This population spread equates to an 8.32 differential, which, while greater than 5%, is still within the parameters that the state has considered acceptable. On the right, just for your information, is the acreage of each supervisorial district. This was the map that was considered by your board at the August 9th meeting. You provided some direction to staff to make some modifications, and staff has made those modifications. One of the requirements that staff has implemented over the last month is the preparation of a legal description for each supervisorial district. In the preparation of that legal description, staff identified one area where there was an existing parcel that was divided by 2 supervisorial districts. This parcel is off Sierra College Boulevard, which is in this location here, and this is Highway 193. Based upon the division of population, staff concluded it was appropriate to take this parcel and move it into District 3. That did result in a total population change of 242 persons. With that change, this is the new modified map that staff has presented to you for your consideration as it relates to the new supervisorial districts. Staff is available to respond to any questions you may have. There is a list of recommendations for the board to take, one of which is to request that staff return with a public hearing on October 11th for the final action for the supervisorial district boundaries. Staff is available to respond to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Michael. Kirk.
Yes, Michael, I'm looking at the map in our board packet on page 173 on the action that we just took under the MOU and in regard to annexation. And it appears to me that the map on 173 shows the Sierra Vista specific plan area, which we just established the MOU for, as actually jutting a little bit west, whereas the map proposing the districts seems to indicate that it actually, District 2 actually moved further to the east. And so I'm curious as to what the net effect would be, and then obviously would seek the thoughts or concurrence of my colleagues on actually including the entirety of the Sierra Vista specific plan area into District 1, consistent with the board's previous direction that we try to keep incorporated cities, those areas that we know are going to be incorporated cities, just in 2 supervisorial districts.
It does appear that there is a discrepancy in that area. The intent was to have the entirety of Sierra Vista within District 1. There is no population out in that area, so it would be very easy to make that modification to be consistent with the action the board previously took regarding annexation.
Okay. Then, Mr. Chairman, at the close, I'd be prepared to offer an amendment to include the entire Sierra Vista community plan area into District 1.
For everyone, I'm good with that also. Jack.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment. I know, and actually ask your opinion. I know that there was a concern with the future growth area. There was a correspondence that came from the chamber requesting that the future growth area be included in District 1. And at our last meeting, it was discussed that because of the PCCP and Roseville's not participating in it presently, that you would advise against that. We did have some discussions with regards to the possibility in the future, if the city of Roseville was to begin to participate in the PCCP, of that line being changed in the future. Can that happen?
The short answer is yes. Staff has consulted with County Council, and there is nothing in state law that prohibits the Board of Supervisors from modifying supervisorial district boundaries during the 10-year period. So should the city of Roseville annex additional lands in the future, it would be appropriate for the board to consider modifying the district boundaries so that Roseville would still have 2 supervisors representing it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Curiosity, Michael, with those modifications, is there also some, probably a question for Tony, I guess, but is there a controlling population impact? I'm assuming that you can't get into horrible distortion of relative population equality as you make these modifications throughout the 10-year between census tracts.
I'll defer to County Council on that.
So, having never had an interim experience before, I had to look at the government code. There is a long-standing government code provision since 1947, which makes it slightly older than me, that gives the convenience, at the convenience of the Board of Supervisors, it can change its districts. It doesn't give a lot of direction. I guess my instinct is that if you were going to proceed in changing supervisorial districts under that discretionary statute, you would have to follow a process that's substantially similar to the process we're going through this year, with appropriate notices, appropriate public involvement. And in the end, you would be confined by the basic constitutional rule of one person, one vote, and so you can't have a distortion at the end. But the reality is, the last 10 years, we saw enormous change in the West, and the district supervisors numbers are quite out of balance now. There's no reason why the board couldn't, in 5 or 6 years, should the numbers offer up a chance, correct that balance quicker than the census.
But it sounds like your interpretation is that we would have to go through a process similar to what we're going through currently.
I can tell you the government code is sparse in its wording and doesn't offer much, but I think given the constitutional premises of why you have to rebalance every 10 years and given the process that's really well spelled out in the election code, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't feel compelled to follow that same process or something substantially similar.
One of the advantages would be that there is little to no population out in that area, so it presumably would not skew the numbers between supervisorial districts should the boundaries be modified to the west.
Right. And as you think through that, just for discussion, which jurisdiction, and I guess in my perspective is probably less relevant as it relates to the conservation plan implications as to whether or not it's reserve and or an area for development opportunity. But those are issues to engage in as we go forward. Kirk, do you still have? That's right. Jim.
Yeah, I just want to thank the board for this relatively easy decision. When you look at Sacramento County and Sacramento City, they're still fighting over who's going to be where. I'm somewhat saddened that the county seat Auburn will now go into District 5, and that's my home. It's been my home my family's home for generations. I just want to let anybody know that's listening out there that I'll still be an Auburn boy. I know where, Placer High grad, right? I know so many families, every once in a while I'll run into a young fellow or a young lady and start talking to them, and next thing I know I went to school with their grandmother, or, so I know where all the bodies are buried. I know who used to go out with who, etc. So anyhow, I am saddened that I lose Auburn, but I'm sure that it'll be capably administered by my colleague here, and I'll always be at your disposal. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Jennifer.
I thank you for your very gracious words, and believe me, I will be turning to you for advice and counsel. I also wanted to thank this board, but I really wanted to thank Kelly Berger, who's sitting out in the audience. Kelly's done a lot of the heavy lifting on this, and this has not been a simple task. My one opportunity where I was able to sit down with you and see really what was involved in making sure that school districts and voting precincts and fire districts and MACs and everything else that was involved in this process were not adversely impacted in the redistricting was just an incredibly complicated process, and my hat really goes off to you. You did a terrific, terrific job. You were very, very responsive and receptive to our input, good, bad, or indifferent. And I just really wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to you personally, because you did much of the heavy lifting, and you didn't necessarily get the recognition, at least from us, that you deserve. I know you get it from the folks you work with over at CDRA. Also just wanted to let Supervisor Holmes know that the one thing that I have heard from people in the Auburn area is they are sad to be losing you as their representative, and they will still be picking up the phone and calling you. So don't feel like you're entirely off the hook. My thanks to you. I think this has been, as Supervisor I think it was Holmes said, when you compare us with Sacramento, this has been a fairly simple process, at least from our perspective. I know it has not been simple from your perspective. The input from the community has been largely overwhelmingly positive in terms of these changes, And for those folks who did have some concerns when we explained some of the parameters that we set as a board and why we did some of the things we did, people really did understand and appreciate the challenges that face us. One of the concerns I know that Mr. Garabedian, who has here today, has raised is, what happens when you take a largely rural district like District 5 and you add a fairly robust city like the city of Auburn into it, and what does that do in terms of representation for the urban part of the rural part of our community. And I just wanted to go on record as saying, while I'm thrilled to have the city of Auburn come into the district and be part of the area that I'm honored to represent, I am still going to be a staunch and firm advocate for the rural parts of our county and make sure that their voice continues to be heard. So thanks to all of you.
Anyone from the public wish to address this item?
Good morning. I'm Michael Garabedian, President of Friends of the North Fork. I live about a mile over the border in Citrus Heights. Our board has property owners and Placer County families and our activists. This proposal does not protect the rural integrity of the county or the rural interest or community interest to the degree that we are looking into. We have 4 supervisor districts that are urbanizing and suburbanizing, and our question is, why can't we have one truly rural district? Placer County is the first in so many things. The county needs a representative really for the rural economy that represents it solidly. You think of the forestry and agriculture, the water from this county that supports the rest of the state, the recreation interests, and how the businesses and support for those activities is needed. This is a process, a historic process that's critical to our country and our values and our politics. You think about how these aspects of the economy I've mentioned are supported mainly by labor input and entrepreneurial creativity, not a lot of capital input. And here we are in a critical economic time when those kind of values that build tremendous multipliers of economic input based on little capital input need not just support but representation. We can't believe that the United States Supreme Court means that we can't have one truly rural district, and that the rural United States doesn't have a political value that has to be recognized. As a footnote, after those Supreme Court decisions passed, there was an effort among the states. The states can reverse a Supreme Court decision, and almost enough states weighed in to act on that, but they didn't, of course. There weren't quite enough states. The county has had an excellent process up to now. We really commend the departure from the percentage and the reasons for it on page 4 or 5 of the staff report. This is terrific. We think those arguments need to be taken further. We think now that we see the results, we would hope that the county would consider changing its goals and have a goal of a truly rural district. Auburn was at one time the economic hub of Up County. The soil in Auburn didn't freeze. The miners came down for the winter. It was as many small towns are throughout still in rural counties, it was the economic hub for the forestry and agriculture and other uses. But this has changed. It is a critical value that you have rural representation. Each supervisor's district does, but having every district with this nature needs to be rethought now in this critical time. I think Placer County is ahead of other counties in getting to this critical juncture where you will lose a true rural district representation, and it's time to look at everything that's happened up to now and say, should we try to figure out a way to have a truly rural district using the factors that have been brought to bear in the deviation that's in the excellent staff report now. So these are things we're looking at. We're really concerned about not having a solid rural district. We're concerned about the combining of the PCWA, 2 districts into one, and the loss of that representation. We don't know exactly what to do about it. We're looking for leadership from the county and from the community to figure out what to do. It's a unique problem. Others will have it or do have it, and we hope that the answer can be found. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else from the public like to address the board on this item? See no one, bring it back to the board, and Jim's light and Kirk's light are both on. So Jim first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, just want to let everyone know that I still represent quite a bit of the rural part of Placer County, from Hoper, Newcastle, Penryn, the Sherland Tract area to the east, and the town of Loomis has a no-growth policy, and much of the area of Loomis is rural. And I know Supervisor Wygant, many areas in his district are rural, extremely rural, if I might add. I am concerned about representing our rural folks as well.
Thanks. Kirk?
Yeah, and adding on to that, this board is far more impacted by the representative of these districts than the representation of urban versus rural. And I think that though throughout the years we might have had representatives on a singular basis that might have been one way or the other a little too far, over the course of the years this board has, I think, continued to chart a fairly center course and quite frankly fairly aggressive course in the preservation and enhancement of our rural characteristics and the opportunities for recreation, agriculture, those things that you mentioned. I'd point out an item that's on our agenda later, the PCCP, which this board has stood unified behind, and I've given the last 5 years as a representative of what you would deem an urban district, I presuppose. I've given the last 5 years to trying to craft a strategy with Supervisor Wygant that helps us preserve and enhance the rural character of this county. So I take great exception that you would somehow be implying that a representative from a more suburban or urban district might somehow discount the importance of the rural nature of this county when in fact this board has stood fairly unified in doing whatever we can to enhance and embrace it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I suppose you need to close the public hearing, and I'm prepared to make a motion.
Public hearing is closed, and bring it back to the board for action.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that we direct staff to make the modification that I mentioned earlier in regard to having the boundaries of District 1 reflect the Sierra Vista Plan area that is now subject to the MOU based on the action the board previously took, and then come back to us at a notice public hearing on October 11th so that at 10 o'clock so that our board can make a final decision on the map.
Moved in second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, guys. Okay, so our next timed item is 11 o'clock, where we'll take up the county budget, and so currently we will adjourn into closed session. Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The board will take up the items on page 3, dealing with litigation, item number 6. There's several lawsuits to discuss and maybe some labor, if we have time. I'll see if I can find some time for you, Tom.
Yeah.
We'll do
Thank you,
labor
Tony.
after the lawsuits. Really good. That magnetic personality. Mostly just a Some guys got it.
And some don't. Okay. The board has returned from closed session, and we are reconvening September 13th board meeting. Tony, would you please report out?
Oh,
please.
The board has returned from closed session. It's taken up the items on page 3 of its agenda, item 6. Now, with regards to the item 1, County of Sonoma, the board received a brief status report on that matter. Item 2B, Meta Vista Protection, the board agreed to increase the contract for special counsel from $125,000 to a total of $160,000. With regards to items C and D, Supervisor Euler recused himself from the conversations. The board received a report with regards to those matters, those administrative proceedings, and authorized the county council to participate in defending the interests of the county and the named employees. With regards to item E, Rob Collins et al. Versus the County of Placer, the board received a status update on settlement discussions of that matter, which remains pending on appeal in the 3rd District Court of Appeal. We did not get the labor. I anticipate we will have a labor discussion later today. That closes this report.
Thanks, Tony. So we will now take up our 11 o'clock timed item, which is a public hearing to consider the final 2011-12 budget.
Good morning. My name is Graham Knaus. I'm the Finance and Budget Operations Manager, and I'm here to walk through the final public hearing related to the 11-12 budget. The purpose of this morning's discussion is related to, first, following up from the August budget workshops related to your board's direction in terms of the recommended 11-12 final budget. Second, to convene the required public hearing related to the final budget, and then following that to request your board's direction related to packaging up the final budget for final consideration September 27th. As you well know, there have been a number of discussions related to the budget throughout this year, and if we look back beginning in January all the way through the budget workshops, there have been 16 budget-related discussions before your board, ferreting out implications related to the state budget, also focusing on some of the challenge areas, some of which are state-driven and some of which are a local reflection of property tax and other matters. Overall state of the county remains financially strong, and it's the past actions of your board that have set up that foundation. Within your board's policy direction, the county is positioned quite well relative to what is an ongoing struggling economy. As we discussed at the workshop, that doesn't mean it's easy. There have been a number of challenges that your board has addressed over the course of the last several years, and the state budget for 11-12 may require a new approach in some areas, particularly in terms of redevelopment and realignment. Out-year pressures certainly trigger some planning today, and your board took action at the budget workshop related to that very point in terms of directing some dollars, additional dollars, to the general fund reserve and the operating contingencies. From a historical standpoint, Placer County has been the second fastest growing county in the state over the last 10 plus years, with 100,000 new residents. Most of that growth has indeed occurred in the cities, and this piece is slightly updated from what you've last seen. From a revenue growth, revenue standpoint, if we flash back to 1977, 78 and the Proposition 13 era revenues, and we adjust those by inflation, bring them up to today, revenues have actually dropped on a per capita basis by nearly 8% just since 2007-8, and by a like amount since Proposition 13. On the expenditure side, in terms of per capita, they're slightly lower than where they were in 1978, about $5 per capita lower than they were in inflation-adjusted dollars. It is your board's policy and direction that has kept this county financially strong during this economic slump, and the policy, county financial policies that were originally put in place in 2003 have been a strong guiding force in terms of that, in terms of having a long-term fiscal planning tool. Since 2007, as you know, there's been a hiring freeze in place, updated from what you've last seen. That has led to attrition of 398 fewer filled positions than at the outset of the 2007-8 fiscal year. As you know, over the course of the last several years, there have been 19 layoffs due to diminished state funding or workload, and that reflects about 0.7% of the county's workforce. Much lower than what has occurred in a number of other regional entities. There have been 21 days of the mandatory time off. We've transitioned away from that in the 11-12 fiscal year. Certainly the increased pension and healthcare cost sharing has been put in place. And in terms of prioritizing towards core services, your board has reduced the general fund support to capital projects in the midst of this economic challenge. From $18 plus million back in 2007-8 down to $3.5 million in 11-12. In all of that, the county has largely maintained service levels, and that's in large part due to proactive planning on the part of your board and also what I would describe as our fantastic staff here in Placer County as compared to others. So what do the numbers look like? Moving forward from the workshop, the recommended 11-12 final budget is $8 million higher than it was in 2010-11. That's about 1%. The note on this is that if you recall, there's a technical accounting change related to budgeting of 1991 realignment revenues. And if we adjust for that, the actual operating budget or effective budget is decreasing by about $8 million year over year, and that's about a 1% decrease. Looking back to 2007-8, there's been about a 3+% decrease in the overall budget, and as discussed at the workshop, the peak actually in the overall county budget was in 2008-9, and if we compare back to that, there's been a $116 million decrease, or 13%, in the overall budget since 2008-9, the peak there. The assessment roll, given that property tax is the county's largest discretionary revenue source, this is a very important chart, certainly from 2001 to 8 when things were going well, and there was an increase in the real estate value, therefore the property tax. That's now been replaced over the past few years with declines. The good news is that the decline in 2011 is half of what it was in 2010. Of course, it still went down by nearly 3%, and so we have a continual struggle related to the property tax revenue and the impact on your board's flexibility related to the budget. Total budget comparison, breaking down by the major funds. The general fund goes up $12 million on this chart year over year. Recall that includes that adjustment related to realignment. When we back that out, there's a year over year decline in the general fund. I'll also note that this includes provisions to reserves and the contingency, which comprise a significant amount of dollars that we'll talk about in just a second in terms of the change year over year. The Public Safety Fund increases by $10 million compared to 2010-11. Recall that there is there's carryover fund balance related to public safety. There's additional dollars that are going into the reserve there, and there's the new public safety realignment of $3.5 million that is leading to the increase. So we have an increase in responsibility and the associated dollars related to that. Capital projects actually goes down substantially year over year related to timing of the South Placer Jail. Much of the costs related to that project were incurred in 10-11. There are residual pieces of that for that project to be completed in the current fiscal year, 2011-12. And then the Public Ways and Facilities Fund, or the Road Fund, you'll see a significant increase from year over year. That again is a function of the timing related to projects between fiscal years, primarily related to the Forest Hill Bridge project, which is their big $60-70 million project in their budget. Quick snapshot related to how the dollars are appropriated amongst the different funds. The general fund, as you can see, reflects about half of the overall county budget. That's where the support to some of the other funds, certainly to public safety, to capital projects, and other board priorities comes from. So it begins in the general fund, and then there'll be a support out from that, including the general fund supporting operations to all of the associated general fund departments. By category, salary and benefits, we're a service organization comprised of people. And so salaries and benefits reflect they're the largest category with respect to this chart at $275 million. It's a slight decrease from what you last saw related to the some changes in the overall funded positions. Services and supplies at $100 million. Capital construction and debt service, which includes both the capital projects fund and also the road fund related to infrastructure. And the other charges, which primarily reflect mandated state programs by way of our client aid budget, and there are a few other things tucked in there, and the transfers, which reflect internal charges within the county. So that would include general fund support to other budgets. This has been updated to reflect where the final 11-12 budget would put you relative to the reserve. As you can see, through 2010-11, the reserve had been declining as your board was taking a phased approach to utilizing reserves to mitigate impacts of the economy. In 2011-12, through your board's direction related to the August workshop, dollars were added back into the general fund reserve, and that brings the total up to $13.1 million compared to the $8 million in 2010-11. Key changes overall in the final budget: expenditures increase slightly at 0.7%. Revenues at about 2%. Again, recall that with the technical adjustment related to budgeting realignment, that if you back that out, there's actually a year-over-year decline in these numbers. And funded positions from 10-11 into 11-12 decreased by 62 or 2.6% of the overall funded positions in the budget. From a filled position standpoint, where we sit in 11-12, there are, due to attrition, there are 100 fewer filled positions in 11-12 than there were in 10-11, than there was in the 10-11 budget. At the budget workshop, your board included all the final budget adjustments, directed staff to include all the final budget adjustments in what's before you today, also to add $4.9 million to the general fund reserves and increase the appropriation for contingency to meet the budget and financial policy amount of 1.5%. And that calculates out to $5.6 million in that contingency. There was also direction basically related to continuing a measured course related to the economy to ensure that there's a sustainable operation going forward. Adjustments to the proposed budget in total, moving from the proposed to the final, there's an increase of $45 million. Much of that is a function of the road fund and that Forest Hill Bridge related project. That's $38 million of the increase from proposed to final. That has no material impact on the general fund. It's more of a timing of the project that is federally and state funded. There are also, on the general fund side, a $10.7 million increase from the proposed to final. That's comprised of two different pieces. The first is the dollars that your board directed be set aside related to the reserve and contingencies. That's about half of that. And then secondly, some rebudgets related to federal Homeland Security grants of over $1 million and HHS revenues, which are 100% federal and actually 100% state revenues related to realignment and also Mental Health Services Act contracts that your board approved on the 9th of August. The Public Safety Fund, $6.6 million increase from the proposed to the final budget. As I mentioned, that's a function of the of dollars going into the reserve and also the 2011 public safety realignment. We've talked about public ways and facilities in terms of the road fund, capital projects going down slightly from the proposed given timing of projects, and on the whole, other operating funds decreasing by about a little over $3 million from the proposed to the final. There is a pass-through on the as it relates to fire, there is a $6 million change in the way funds flow related to the CAL FIRE contract that used to go through the fire fund, and those have been pulled out. And so it appears to be a substantial decrease in the funding there. It's just a different way to budget those dollars. They'll be more direct with the CSAs than flowing through the fire fund. And then on the special district side, $10 million in changes from the proposed to the final. Most of that is a function of adding dollars to the reserve. There's also a $3 million related to the SMD1 compliance upgrade project, which is the budget is a planning document. The dollars will be put in there. And to move forward on that project would require board's approval related to which direction to go related to SMD1 or the regional sewer discussion that your board will have at some point in the future. So in August, we talked about how there is this change related to the state budget and certainly the approach in terms of realignment. That is the largest change in the state-county fiscal relationship that has occurred in probably more than 20 years. The redevelopment change is a significant one as well. Unemployment does remain high overall. These numbers are updated since what you last saw. Statewide, we're at 12%, which is a slight improvement over what it was in the prior year. And here in Placer, we're below that at 11.2%, which still is very high compared to where we were just a few years ago at 6%. Real estate continues to struggle, and on the one positive sign, there has been some slow but steady sales tax growth, which could be a positive sign related to the economy. It could be a positive sign related to funding for realignment, as that's a very significant piece of the funding for realignment. Continued federal and state uncertainty, which are going to cause perhaps some challenges up ahead for us as we look out through the end of 11-12 and into 12-13. So we know there's going to be more change in the near and midterm future. Exactly what that's going to look like is nearly anyone's guess at the moment. And certainly the last few days of the legislative session last week highlighted that point with significant, almost monumental changes in approach to several different topics in terms of taxes and other things that were near certain and then near dead almost within a matter of minutes in terms of how things were playing out within the legislature. So there's more to come at mid-year related to, one, a check-in in terms of the potential trigger cuts at the state level. Their revenues have improved. It's hard to talk about being short $400 million and considering that an improvement, but it actually is an improvement over where things were in July. Year to date, the state is 3.4% below what their projections are. And recall that if those projections don't get hit, then there are potential cuts to us of up to $1 million. Personal income tax actually went up by over $100 million in July, in August. So that's a positive sign. But on the flip side of that, the corporate taxes actually went down by nearly 5%. So it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of what's happening with state revenues. And certainly there's the realignment HHS programs, which may trigger a change in the approach to budgeting that as we finalize what the amounts will be related to the 2011, the HHS portion of the 2011 realignment, and figure out the best way to budget those dollars as the county moves forward. And then, as you well know, the Community Correction Partnership, that public safety realignment planning process is underway. We'll come back to your board sometime between now and January, and there's a policy component to that, and then your board would have authority related to how to appropriate dollars related to that for meeting the public safety realignment responsibilities. So with that, I would request your board to first convene the required public hearing on the 11-12 budget, and then I'll pause and talk about the rest of this slide once that has occurred.
Thanks, Graham.
Sure.
Questions, comments by the board at this time? Seeing none, I'll open this up to a public hearing. Is anyone from the public who'd like to address the board or ask questions regarding the budget? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the board. Basically, the request is to approve this as the final budget, correct?
Right. So there are some specific actions laid out in your agenda related to directing staff to finalize the resolution. The final budget is adopted via resolution, and all the accompanying required attachments. And so I would request your board take that action related to the 11-12 budget.
And for the board's edification, that's all listed on your agenda under item 2, and then it goes on to 1 through 8 in terms of specific actions.
So we can take that all in one motion.
I'll go ahead and move approval of the county executive budget. Item number 1, approve, I believe it's $45.5 million net increase in appropriations to county budget, attachment A. Approve allocations for operating funds, attachment B. Item 3, approve allocations for proprietary funds, attachment C. Approve items listed on the master fixed asset list, attachment D. Approve the recommend position allocation listing, attachment E. Approve reserve provisions and cancellations of county funds, attachment F. Item 7, approve allocations of the Board of Supervisor government special districts, attachment G. And item 8, authorize the auditor controller to make technical non-substantive budget adjustments to the final budget.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the just presented 2011-12 final budget and make all of the necessary adjustments as delineated in Part 2, items 1 through 8. Kirk?
Yes, just under discussion, Mr. Chairman. I think that the real untold story here, Graham points out, rightly so, that the county is in a, I wouldn't say a strong economic position, but healthy, in spite of the contagion going on in local government around us. And this board has taken steps, as is illustrated in the staff report, to implement real reductions in spending, not what we hear out of Washington, which are reductions in anticipated growth of spending, but actual real year-over-year reductions in spending to the tune of, absent this this little game that we have to play with the realignment dollars, to the tune of a 5% reduction in general fund spending in 4 fiscal years. And that is real, and it is meaningful, and is what has set this county up for long-term viability in order to meet the obligations that we have to our taxpayers and to our employees. be they pension or health care obligations. And so, as the charts seem to indicate, given assessed valuations and the rather precipitous drop-off we've seen there, what we know to be the case in the land development environment, where we're not seeing new parcels created and therefore the growth in the assessed valuation, we know that we're certainly not coming out of, but perhaps in the midst of this long storm. And I, for one, want to congratulate this board and our staff in particular for the job that they've done in preparing us to weather this storm and putting us in this good position.
Thanks, sir. Any other questions or comments? I'll just echo that, Graham, and I think one of the things you brought to the table this year, I want to personally thank you for. And finance, oftentimes, the key challenge is to be able to communicate not only to the board, but all of our constituents. So I think we've made some great progress, not only in the substantive part of having a healthy budget, particularly under the circumstances, but it's very important that we make sure that that word gets out and we can explain to our constituents how we've gotten to where we are. So appreciate that. All those in favor of the motion say aye. 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 Opposed? Motion carries. Oh, okay.
I was just going to make a comment along the same lines that as the budget turns right now, we are, it's fairly decent sailing, but we still need to remain vigilant. So, thank you.
Thanks. Tony.
Yeah, my clock.
Perfect. Since it's perfectly 11:30, we will now take up our 11:30 timed item with approval by County Council, which is an update of the Placer County Conservation Plan and then some items for discussion. So we're going to start off with a presentation, a brief presentation overview by staff, and we will then take it from there. Lauren.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. Briefly this morning, what I'd like to provide is an update for the board. It's been a little while since we've been back providing the whole board with information on the status of the PCCP. And then there are some policy issues that both Supervisors Wygant and Euler would like to bring to the board for a discussion. So what I would like to do first is just giving you an overall update in terms of the status, because there's been a considerable amount of work that's been done over the past few months. This board authorized that staff submit an agency review draft conservation plan to the wildlife agencies as well as the Corps of Engineers and EPA last January, and that document was submitted in February. Since that time, we've been conducting a whole series of meetings with all of the agencies that have been involved in the PCCP, focusing on the levels of programmatic coverage that we've been trying to get for both wetlands as well as endangered species over the course of 50 years. The focus has been on those chapters of the document that we prepared that really serve as the conservation strategy, because that's where the deal resides. Can we develop a conservation strategy that both Placer County, City of Lincoln, Placer County water agencies, the partners who are working together today, can fulfill a series of requirements over the course of 50 years to meet our obligations under the State and Federal Endangered Species Act as well as federal wetlands laws. And we've made good progress. On page 137 of your package, there's an Exhibit C, which is an attachment that provides more detail than the staff report itself on where we believe the fundamental outstanding issues are. And what I'd like to do briefly is sort of walk through that list of issues. There are agency representatives here from both Fish and Game and the Fish and Wildlife Service. I know that they would like to provide brief remarks to the board, and then we'll turn it back to the chair and Supervisor Euler for any additional discussion that you might have regarding the other issues that are raised in the staff report. So with that, issue number one that's been raised really is on the conservation strategy just in general. What we've prepared is a plan that is really trying to accomplish two things. We're trying to conserve the landscape of western Placer County as sort of a balance to the growth that we consider in our various general plans. Within that conservation strategy, we're also trying to mitigate. And one of the concerns that the agencies have raised is that there's an overemphasis on the mitigation component of this plan and an insufficient emphasis on overall conservation. We believe we have a sound conservation strategy. We believe there's places to take that discussion. We believe that this issue, while relevant and probably at the top of the list, because we must have a sound conservation strategy, nevertheless is one that, with good communication back and forth between us and the wildlife agencies, we will make good progress there. The second issue that they've raised relates to the term of the permit. Placer County, City of Lincoln, PCWA, are requesting a 50-year permit term. What they are asking for is a sound justification for that term, because that is a long time for them to sort of grant to us local discretion, local decision-making over the endangered species and wetland issues. And we have an argument that we're preparing. We think it's a sound argument, and it largely is based upon how growth will occur over the next 50 years, how much growth will occur, and the need to account for that and cover that through the PCCP. Another issue that they've raised, which is the issue that we have probably spent the most time talking about, is the reserve area itself, the so-called purple map, which I believe is on the screen to my left. It's the area within which we would develop a conservation landscape. It's the area within which we would also mitigate. On the valley floor in particular, there have been lengthy discussions about the amount, the type of conservation that would occur, particularly for vernal pool grasslands. That remains an outstanding issue that we will continue to deliberate on. Occurrence data is a relatively new issue for us to struggle with. It's a new and old issue. Placer County is host to about 32 species on the west side that we think need coverage through this program. By their very nature, they are rare. We don't know where they're at. It's very difficult to find them, see them, account for them. Made more difficult for us is the fact that we have very little public land. Many HCPs and CCP efforts across the nation have large amounts of federal land or state lands within which you learn a lot about the species that are present. Our lands are almost 100% private. We don't have access to those places. So therefore, we have to draw conclusions about the presence or absence of those species through modeling, through an analysis of what we can get from aerial photos and other mapping sources, and attempt to draw conclusions. What the wildlife agencies are saying is that lack of occurrence data is something that's going to need additional attention, particularly for the more rare species where we know very little, and we may actually have to conduct field surveys at the time that an impact is occurring and at the time that we would acquire a property. In terms of ratios, the amount of take that's proposed with the amount of growth and the map are all linked together. So as we cause an impact, we need to mitigate for that impact within the reserve area. That reserve area is only so large and only so much land is available. That more or less defines the ratios that we work with. In particular, for the vernal pool species, we continue to hear from the wildlife agencies that the ratios are insufficient for them, at least at this point in time, to authorize a permit to go forward. Linked to that is levels of take. We have a growth projection out to the year 2060. That growth projection was based upon the trends of, say, the 2005, 6, 7 growth rates, so it's a fairly assertive or aggressive growth rate. But nevertheless, it represents a real-world scenario of what is possible in Placer County. That amount of growth, that level of take that's proposed, coupled with our map, is a challenge to balance all those things. So as you deal with the map, you deal with the ratios, you deal with the levels of take, they're all three intertwined. If you can address all three and successfully with concurrence of the agencies, we have a sound project description that can move forward. Mitigation outside the plan area, this is really a twofold issue. One is we are proposing to continue to coordinate with Sutter County. There is an area of the Coon Creek watershed in the floodplain of Coon Creek that passes out of Placer into Sutter, back in Placer, and back into Sutter again. We would like to see that roughly 1,700 acres under conservation. Additionally, salmon and steelhead only get into Placer County in the Auburn Ravine and Coon Creek system through Sutter County. So if there are issues with fish passage in Sutter County, it doesn't help us accomplish our objectives in the foothills for spawning and rearing of salmon and steelhead if there remain issues in Sutter County. The second issue as it relates to mitigation outside Placer County relates to mitigation banks. Placer Counties continue to express concerns about out-of-county credit sales if, in fact, that diminishes our ability to conduct the business that we want to conduct under the PCCP. If, in fact, a credit sale as it occurs is a loss of habitat value to us and unavailable for preservation for our objectives, there may be an increment of economic development activity that then doesn't occur during the 50-year term. And then lastly, just the overall concern over vernal pool grasslands. The wildlife agencies, particularly Fish and Wildlife Service, is concerned at a number of levels that, one, that the reserve map may not have sufficient area for vernal pool grasslands, two, that those ratios are low, three, that as mitigation occurs, they want to ensure at the end of the permit term that we have built a reserve system that is contiguous, much like we went through with the redistricting, that you not have a whole series of fragmented, disjointed parcels all across the landscape, and also that we commit early and frequently to a core area, that there's a minimal area that needs to be delivered, and it's so the so-called best of the best comes in early and quickly, and then we build on that success over time. In terms of where we go from here, addressing these issues will continue to be a part of the dialogue at the ad hoc committee. Once we reach some agreements on those issues, we will go back to the wildlife agencies with a revised document. Once we reach general concurrence on the conservation strategy, then two key elements of the work program start: preparation of the final EIS as well as the finance plan. As previously mentioned to the board, we continue to sit on those contracts, not spend the money in those areas until that we are assured that we have a sound conservation strategy and project description to go ahead and move forward with. So from this point forward, it's really a deliberation within the ad hoc committee. There's other chapters that we're working on more technical issues, but the conservation strategy itself is largely to be a dialogue between staff of the county of Placer and the city of Lincoln, and depending on where the next conversation goes, potentially the city of Roseville. Any questions at all on the status of the work program?
See none at this point. Thanks, Lauren. So I think with Lauren's advice, I'll turn it over next. I know there's folks here from the regulatory agencies that would like to make presentations to it. So excuse me. So if you'd like to come forward and state your name, and we'd be very happy to hear your words.
Good morning. My name is Sandra Mori. I'm with the Department of Fish and Game in Sacramento. I just wanted to say that the department makes these types of large landscape level conservation planning efforts a priority across the state. And we've been involved with the Placer County plan for some time, and we're willing to continue and even increase our staff participation in the planning effort to get it move it to completing the planning phases and onto the implementation phase. And as Lauren said, there are still some issues to be worked out, but we believe that by working together with you and all of the agencies involved, that we can come up with a comprehensive plan that addresses both economic growth and relieves some regulatory burdens, and also comes up with a final plan that protects species and habitats across the landscape. Just wanted to mention, in addition to our ongoing participation, also that we were able to secure a Section 6 planning assistance grant for the Placer plan, and it just demonstrates another way that we're committed to helping you complete the plan. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric Tattersall. I'm with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. I just wanted to reiterate some of Sandy's comments and just let you know that the service has been involved in the PCCP for a number of years, and we continue to be dedicated to this process. It's a high priority for our agency to come to a conclusion on this project as soon as possible. I think we've made some significant progress in the recent past few months, and I'm available for any questions you have. I did bring some staff with me if you wanted to get into any details.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Any questions at this time? Or I don't see any currently, but really appreciate you folks coming up and making yourselves available. Any other questions or comments by staff or to staff or with regards to staff and the board? Keeping in mind that twofold in this conversation today, the reason why Kirk and I wanted to put it on the agenda was to check in with the board, provide an opportunity as we enter what I'm confident is the final phase of these negotiations, a chance for the board to have in a public hearing a chance to have any questions answered or details addressed. But then in addition to that, as we were going through the final phases of this process, Kirk, as a member of the ad hoc committee, came up with what I consider to be a grand idea, a vision idea, which essentially would provide the opportunity for Roseville to join the plan. Keeping in mind that over the last, Kirk complains about being on the ad hoc committee for 5 years, but over the last 12 years, we've had many conversations with a lot of folks and including different conversations with representatives from the city of Roseville on different occasions as to their interest in joining the plan or not. Up until this point in time, they have not done that. But Kirk's idea would really be a visionary perspective of looking at the remaining growth potential of all of South Placer, particularly as it relates to the jurisdictions of Lincoln and Roseville, and the county being the places where the preponderance of remaining urban growth will occur. But it would be an opportunity to have what could potentially be, I think, a much more efficient delivery and cost-effective and better planning for South Placer. And with that, Kirk, as chair, I'm going to turn it over to you because it's your plan, your idea, and let you take it from this point.
Steer the bus right at me.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The notion of incorporating Roseville into the PCCP at this point largely stemmed from the exercise that we just concluded with our budget item. As this board knows, we have been deeply engaged in our budgeting process for the last 3 years, even more aggressively so this year. And this past January-ish, right about the time that the governor's first proposed budget hit, and I started hearing what local jurisdictions around the state were going to have to do in reaction, it occurred to me that those counties, and I think if you look around the state right now, you'll see that those counties that are the most impinged by the existing budget conditions are those that have seen fairly significant urbanization within the unincorporated area. And you have then the issue of the duplication of levels of service by the county having to provide in various pockets that are unincorporated services that are otherwise provided by the cities in those areas that are incorporated. And we as a county, I think rightly so, in our 94 general plan had a policy of directing most of the urbanized growth into the cities, largely for that very reason, the delivery of services. And I just thought that as we moved forward with the conservation plan, in the long-term interests of our constituents, and whether that is ours as just constituents of unincorporated Placer County, or ours meaning constituents of both an incorporated city and then, of course, within our county, it occurred to me that by Roseville not participating in the conservation plan, it was precluding a future option. It was precluding the future option of a future board being able to make a decision in regard to those areas that we've identified for urbanization under this plan, whether it was in the best long-term financial interest of the county to have that urbanization occur in the unincorporated area or in an incorporated city. Roseville not participating meant that that option was off the table for us and for future boards. And so simply from the standpoint of economic considerations, I just kind of looked at this landscape of development because the conservation plan, I mean, the flip side of that coin is it's a development plan, and the conservation doesn't happen without the development occurring to fund the acquisition of those sensitive parts that are kept in conservation and properly managed in perpetuity. And so when I looked at kind of this landscape plan of development of our county that has been identified for urbanization by our blueprint, our regional blueprint, by this map, certainly recognized by the agencies that there will be urbanization, I simply looked at it from the standpoint of what does the county do well and what do cities do well. And under the proposal that we've been moving forward with Lincoln and the county participating, Lincoln and the county would essentially self-administer our permits. We, the county, for disturbance in the unincorporated area, Lincoln for disturbance in the Lincoln area would issue the permits consistent with the parameters of the PCCP. Under the notion that I began to flesh out with Robert and then with Lauren and then with others as we kind of grew this idea was, what if we just kind of took that area that we've identified as suitable for urbanization, both in our blueprint and in this plan, and what if we just used this future parkway that we're talking about as kind of a line of demarcation for north and south, and the Highway 65 corridor, existing Highway 65 corridor, as kind of that line of demarcation east and west, and say pretty much everything that occurs west of the existing 65 corridor, if it's south of the parkway, may someday, under the PCCP, may someday develop out as Roseville, and if it's north, may someday develop out as Lincoln. Do we have a framework in place that would allow for that, for the optimization of service delivery at the most efficient cost? And without Roseville's participation, the answer is no. We don't have that opportunity. So set about the conversation with Robert and then with Lauren, and then engage the agencies on their sense of engaging Roseville in this process. Oh, and I should note that one of the other things that it would be my desire, and I think it's consistent with what Robert was thinking, the agencies are thinking, and all the rest, is that under this scenario, we would perhaps, and none of this is set in stone, it just creates the opportunity, we would perhaps turn over the urbanization in that area identified for growth to the incorporated cities, but the county would then take responsibility for PCCP administration and permit issuance. So rather than the city of Lincoln self-administering and the county self-administering for permits for disturbance in the unincorporated area, the county would kind of sit in the position of being the issuing agency for permits for disturbance, both north and south of the parkway. And the county would have responsibility for obtaining conservation easements and doing all those things that are on the conservation side of the ledger. So essentially turning over, again, preserving the opportunity for, in the future, the urbanization to occur in the cities and the conservation to be managed by the county. And so we began to flesh this out, and all roads kind of pointed back to Roseville, that without Roseville active in the PCCP, there was no hope of anything like this ever moving forward. And so Robert and I decided, after meeting with Lincoln in our ad hoc forum and discussing this idea with Lincoln, and Lincoln has embraced the idea as well. Of course, it will require an action by their council to accept it and embrace it formally, but their representatives, Mr. Cosgrove and Mr. Short, have embraced this idea of inviting Roseville to the table to participate in the conservation plan so as to maximize the flexibility in the future for whatever shape that urbanization takes, and preserving that option for the possibility of the urbanization occurring within the incorporated cities. Does that sum it up, Robert? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it might be worthwhile, since I think you and I were hoping to have a pretty free-ranging discussion amongst colleagues, and this is a great opportunity. The regulatory agency folks are here, so we can just maybe start with a quick summary. I started in this particular business in 1997 when we initiated basically an effort by the board to begin implementation of the open space policies in the county's general plan, with open space policies being the preponderance of the county's general plan, since we're not a city and we are a county. And it included from the very beginning the opportunity and the notion of potentially negotiating, completing both the Habitat Conservation Plan and the Natural Communities Conservation Plan with the federal and state agencies for a range of opportunities, and we've been at this a long time. So when Kirk first broached this question with me, concerns that I have, and I want to make sure everybody's clear about that, is that in that I turned 60 years old this year, and we started this process back in 1997. I'm very receptive to the idea if everybody had a healthy regional public policy perspective on all of this, it could come together very nicely. But I don't want it to take another 12 years to start that clock over again. A few months is fine with me, but I personally have a threshold of this process not delaying this not delaying the process very long. I also wanted to emphasize the basic notion that we always started out with. One, when we started the open space policy, the board simply wanted to have much stronger effort, greater teeth in our open space policies, implementation of those open space policies, rather than having the cities and the counties update general plans, and in a county like Placer, where we've experienced such incredible growth, to then do another general plan 20 years hence and focus on the open space policies based on the open space that happens to be left as compared to what should be left, and how that ought to be intertwined with our urban edges so that we have the highest level of planning in a long-term visionary manner. So, we've made some great progress. But without this missing link, this critical remaining component of the contractual relationship and partnership with the regulatory agencies, whereby here in Placer County, at a more local level and focused on our specifics and with the resources, since we are here, if we don't implement the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act through an emphasis of local perspective, we're never going to have the grandest portion of what this vision originally held out to be. And the benefit of that includes huge improvements into the cost effectiveness of our development when it occurs, and obviously a much higher level of planning. We have, for no fault of anyone's other than a lack of this kind of process, some great examples of permits. Ones we talk about all the time are in Roseville, and again, no blame to anybody. But there are vernal pool preserves in Roseville as a result of impacts from the Galleria, one of which is functioning still, as I understand it, as a vernal pool complex as best as it can, completely surrounded by urbanization, and another preserve that's no longer functioning even as a vernal pool complex anymore because of urban runoff as a result of additional urban growth. So doing something on a landscape scale like this makes all the sense in the world for a range of reasons, but the participants have to enthusiastically commit to a higher level of outcome. So the request of the board today by Kirk and me is to do something like extend an invitation to Roseville. The result of that, Tony might want to discuss that, would be likely to create something like what we've been doing with Lincoln, of course, is meeting to discuss this more informally, but to formalize that more, probably with representatives, 2 council members from the city of Lincoln, 2 members from the Board of Supervisors, and 2 members from the city of Roseville, if the Roseville wants to take us up on this discussion. And then finally, I just want to emphasize that if you look at the bullets that Lauren discussed as a result of some extensive communication and discussion with the regulatory agencies, if I counted correctly, we have 6 bullet points of areas that we need to resolve, and it's not 600. And some of these are integrally intertwined. If you look at ratios, levels of take, mitigation outside the county plan, they're all pretty much one and the same conversation. And whereas I think we're talking about preservation and better conservation for 5 habitat types that house 32 species that are of some concern, the vernal pool habitat type is the one in Placer County that is the most difficult to deal with, because the consensus is that about 80% of our existing vernal pools in a county that was rich in vernal pools have been filled. There are about 20% left, and we have to figure out a way to provide for urban growth, but avoid what's left, and have that intertwined with restoration in the rest of the reserve area, and provide a high enough level of guarantees that all of that is going to function at a level that's much higher and much more cost effective, both for the development community and for the regulatory agencies, but mostly for those of us who live here and for the people to come after us. So with that,
I think, Robert, if I may, just one final note is that included in the kind of series of meetings to flesh out this idea and determine its feasibility was a meeting that we did have with the regulatory agencies, asking them their thoughts about Roseville's participation. Many of them are represented here, so I won't speak for them, but I'll simply report that at that meeting, the notion was very warmly received by the agencies having Roseville involved in the PCCP.
yeah, I think an outcome that's common for all stakeholders is that there's a much greater level of certainty for the individual stakeholders' perspective as to what the outcome is going to be over the next 50-year period. So with that, questions, comments, and/or discussion. Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems like we're in the very preliminary discussions about Roseville's participation, and since I've been involved in this issue since I've taken office, it was my recollection that Roseville was at some of the meetings, but they weren't really participating in the discussion. So from what I hear, it sounds like the invitation to Roseville is coming from the ad hoc committee, and that Roseville hasn't made any formal invitation to engage. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, Roseville really hasn't participated in any of our meetings. We met with Roseville early. Well, I won't say early on. I'll say early on for me, not early on for Robert. And Robert can speak to the meetings that he had prior to my return to the board. But let me just say, under the previous administration of city management in Roseville, their participation in the PCCP was not necessarily seen as an enhancement to their future, to their opportunities. I think that the current city management looks at this much the way perhaps I view it, and that is keeping everybody's options open. That it's kind of having them involved certainly doesn't hurt them, and collectively may help all of us. So as far as the ad hoc meetings have been concerned, I don't recall Roseville ever participating or sending representatives to participate in those. We did go and meet back when Craig was city manager. We met with Craig, and Jim Gray was mayor at the time, sat down with them to discuss their concerns as it regarded Reason Farms. But that was really the extent of any conversations that I recall us having in the past with Roseville.
Well, there have been conversations where they were invited into the process, and I guess you'd have to say in terms of appropriate protocol, we never got a response. So I'm confident that we can resolve this without them. In a theoretical visionary perspective, we could have a much better result with them in. The preliminary indications are that there's a strong interest in that.
Have there been any direct discussions with staff from Roseville or any of the elected about?
Yeah, Kirk and I met with the city manager, Roseville, expressed a strong interest.
You expressed a strong interest?
No,
in the city manager?
he expressed a strong interest.
I know you have a strong interest.
No, the new city manager did.
I share your concern, though, about the delay, because I know negotiating with Lincoln was long-term to finally get them to buy in, and it's to their benefit. And so I have concern about the delay, if there's any delay with Roseville's participation. So, again, I know we're at a very preliminary start here, but it would seem to me that if Roseville was more interested, that they would be talking to the other board members, and I haven't seen that yet. So, anyhow, I'm open to the idea of continuing the dialogue. Again, I'm just concerned about the delay, if there's any delay, because it's been a long-term process. We started talking about this when I was running for office in 2004, and it took me about 3 years to grasp it. And now that I've got a handle on it, it looks like we're changing the game a little bit. So it's not that it's not exciting, but anyhow, those are my comments. Thank you.
Jennifer.
I would say that as a sort of general discussion idea, I'm certainly not opposed to Roseville coming into this process. As you know, with the exception of bringing bits of District 5 back into it, I have not been largely involved in this process at all. But my perception, having not been involved in it, is that Roseville has really truly not been interested in participating in the past, and something that Supervisor Euler said sort of caught my attention, and not necessarily in a good way. And that was, he said, Roseville is seeing this as an enhancement to their opportunities. And my concern is, while it may be an enhancement to their opportunities, I would need a really clear demonstration that this would be an enhancement to the county's opportunities as well. And so from that perspective, it would need, in my opinion, to be more than just an enhancement to the county in terms of process. I would want to see Roseville bring some actual lands to the table for conservation that aren't included in this current map as part of their commitment to moving this forward, to really show a commitment to the process, not just a, hey, let's all get on board with making the paperwork work. So I'm very much in line with Jim in saying that I'm not opposed to this. I think the discussions probably, should go forward, but I do have some real concerns about why now, when Roseville has very clearly not been interested in being part of this process in the past, and without a clear demonstration that there's going to be enhancement to the county as well as to the city of Roseville. I'd be very skeptical about the process, but would encourage you, within the time constraints that you've identified yourself, to move forward to identifying why this is good for both the county and Roseville.
Sure. And if I may,
yes.
On those points, Jennifer, in terms of Roseville bringing additional land and why it's in their interest and ours. Understand that the areas identified in the map as those set for urbanization will urbanize under this plan. And if, quite frankly, if they don't urbanize, we don't have a conservation plan, because it's through the urbanization that we're able to generate the revenue in order to obtain the conservation easements that we need for a viable conservation plan. Which is why I've always said, while we call this the Placer County Conservation Plan, it's also the Placer County Development Plan. So the question comes down to, since we are recognizing these are the areas that are appropriate for urbanization, the question comes down to who is best suited to provide urban levels of service in these areas as they develop. Each 5 years, Lauren, we're given new numbers by the state in terms of number of housing units we have to be able to make available in order to meet our allocation. Is it every 5 years, 7 years? What is the?
Well, we're going through the process right now, the regional housing allocation process, and it's essentially linked to our housing element, which used to be 5 years. Right. We'll shift to 8 years. 8 years.
So again, as to why it's important to me that Roseville engage and be a part of this is, without them, it puts us as the county in the position of essentially having to be in a position to provide an urban level of service, something that we currently don't do. We don't provide sheriff's protection to an urban level. We don't provide parks and recreation. There are a number of things that we just don't do at an urban level, and we have no experience doing. And quite frankly, when I look at the long-term economic health and viability of us as a county, I don't think it's in our interest to try to get into new businesses along those lines. And so as we build out in what I referred to earlier as a county with our collective constituents, whether it's just unincorporated or it's incorporated, and therefore by virtue of that they are constituents of ours as well, what is in the long-term best economic interest of us as a county, our neighboring cities, but most importantly, the constituents that we are going to serve? How do we provide the highest level of service in the most cost-effective manner? And having Roseville involved doesn't mean that everything that is currently in an unincorporated area will develop as Roseville. It simply means that this board in the future, or future boards, will be in a position where that's an option that's available. If Roseville is not a signatory to this conservation plan, that option is off of the table, and the county has to figure out how we provide an urban level of service as that area develops. As to Roseville's lack of participation in the past. I don't know why. I mean, I have my theories as to why, but all I know is it was very welcomed when a new management came in, a new administration came in with that management, and they were receptive to the idea and enthusiastic about Roseville being at the table.
Jim?
If I may, I don't disagree with much of what you said. The one thing that I do take a bit of issue with is we're presupposing that these areas are going to develop. And that's not necessarily, just given the economic place we find ourselves in as a nation, a given. So we may never be in the position of having to provide an urban level of services in much of this yellow area. And I think, again,
we have two major projects that take up a big chunk of that yellow already that we've already approved.
I realize
at
that.
urban levels.
And they may never be built. I'm just saying we can't really predict the future here. My main concern really is having a demonstrable set of examples of how this is truly going to benefit the county. Again, I'm not opposed to going forward with the discussions. I think it's a very good idea. I do think we should open them. I'm just a little bit skeptical at this point. So, thank you.
And I'll just, I know Jack and Jim have their lights on, but I think your point is really well taken with me. I think there are some examples of how we can demonstrate explicitly how everybody would be better off. And frankly, I'm with you. If we cannot do that with their participation, then we should proceed without them as we have. But Jack and then Jim.
Yeah. Sitting back and listening, there are valid arguments and points that are being made by everyone. And I am not opposed to, number one, keeping an open mind, and number two, looking for efficiencies down the road. I think levels of service, and I've always been taught that you do what you do well, and you stick to doing that, and that seems to work for a lot of folks. At the same time, the question of delay and having everyone have a certain level of skin in the game is important. So for where I stand right now, I'm not opposed to, if we need to, I don't know procedurally how it happens, whether we extend an invitation, that kind of thing. I'm not opposed to exploring that. But at the end of the day, we have to look at the big picture and what all those pieces mean. I think that's the important thing for me, is to how it looks and how we put it together.
Jim?
I wanted to mention a little bit about the county providing services to urban areas. I've lived in North Auburn most of my life, and the county has provided excellent urban services to that area, which is pretty much urbanized. Bowman area as well. Some parts of Granite Bay are urbanized, and the county has provided great services, and I think even in the Tahoe region. So I'm not opposed for the county to move forward providing those types of services. I think we can do it very well.
Tom.
Yes, fine, Mike. Mr. Chairman, I just want to draw the board's attention to page 129. There's 5 bullet points that are in the staff report, because this is not just about a growth, regional growth resolution or thought process about how to move forward, but at heart it's also a financial transaction. And incumbent on that is, as you move forward with these kind of concepts, is the county has to be held whole to be financially able to sustain countywide services and not have one area necessarily cost more than other areas for services. So I think even in the foundation going forward is to make sure that the board's aware that we're looking at the city paying for a fair share of these costs, also the incurred costs of the rather expensive endeavor today, but also as we move forward that, and I think any jurisdiction can provide a robust level of services. It all depends upon how much you want to spend for those services and where those revenues come for those services, whether or not it's a galleria or an auto mall or property tax or something else. There has to be revenues to pay for those services, be they city services or county services. I just want to also, aside from making that point, is also to make sure that
you folks take credit for the financial work that you've done over the last 4 years in steering this county to the position where it is. There's counties indeed like Sacramento County that are in terrible shape, and it's a result of many things and many decisions over a period of time financially. There's also rural counties like Yolo who have made a conscious decision to direct only growth to cities that are in terrible financial shape. So it gets really down to the financial underpinnings of a decision like this to protect the resources of everybody throughout the county. It isn't not necessarily that a county is better or less able to provide services in the city. Anywhere there's going to be efficiencies in terms of delivering services, depending upon where that growth occurs and who's best able to provide the service at that particular juncture. Different areas, it'll always be different answers to that question, but everybody needs to have the financial resources to provide those services. So as much as this is a guidance of future growth and options here, it's also at heart a series of very complicated financial decisions to make sure that everybody can pay for those services that are important to all of the citizens in Placer County.
Okay, Kirk, did you have something else?
Just that, no, I guess at this point.
Okay. So with that, I'll open it up to the public. Anyone who has any questions or comments they'd like to make, board would be very happy to hear those. Seeing none, if there's consensus, we can formalize this or just do it more casually. I think if there's consensus, I think the request from Kirk and me was to see whether or not the board had an appetite for the chair to send a letter to the mayor of Roseville requesting a response from them as to whether or not they have an interest and laying out what would probably be the example of setting up more of a formalized version of the committee that we've been working with Lincoln, and see what kind of response we get back from Roseville and then report back. And if that's okay with everybody, I think we can do that even without a motion. Okay, thanks. All right, well, thank you all. With that, we will reconvene back into closed session to discuss labor negotiations.
And I think you said that's where we're going. And there's two.